We're in the 10 States of God chapter, page 161. Carrying on from where we left off, state Roman numeral 2, God in the Beyond State, is the title. We have already stated that the beyond state of God can never be adequately described. God-realized beings, when they try to describe the beyond state, succeed only in describing the beyond state of God, which is the Allah of the Sufis, the Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Paramatma of Vedantists, God the Father of Christians, and the Oversoul of some philosophers. God in the beyond state is absolute, unlimited, and infinite, the one without a second. Meher Baba, while explaining this second state of God, stressed that fundamentally state 2 is in no way different from state 1 of God. The substates A, B, and C of state 2 of God are what create the difference. Read that again. Meher Baba, while explaining the second state of God, stressed that fundamentally state 2 is in no way different from state 1 of God. The substates A, B, and C of state 2 of God are what create the difference. How, when, and where the difference came into being is described as follows from the explanations of Meher Baba. At the instant when the latent, original, infinite whim of the infinite God to know himself, parentheses, who am I, is about to surge in the unbounded uniformity of the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum of the most original, beyond state of God, the very prospect of this infinite urge to know, prompting the eternally tranquil poise of God in the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, becomes inconceivable. Repeat that one. At the instant when the latent, original, infinite whim of the infinite God to know himself, parentheses, who am I, is about to surge in the unbounded uniformity of the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum of the most original, beyond state of God, the very prospect of this infinite urge to know, prompting the eternally tranquil poise of God in the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, becomes inconceivable. But the fact of the insurge of the infinite whim and its very inconceivability spontaneously brings into being another aspect of God's state other than the most original beyond state of unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, where there is neither prospect of aspect nor attribute, neither the infinite or finite consciousness nor the infinite or finite unconsciousness, and where, except for the infinity of God, which is eternally manifest, every other thing is latent, including the infinite whim and the consequent infinite urge to know. Thus it is that the very inconceivability of the prospect of the infinite whim surging in the beyond state automatically unfolds the perspectiveness, where also latent in the infinite state, which is also latent in the infinite state. Again, thus it is that the very inconceivability of the prospect of the infinite whim surging in the beyond state automatically unfolds the perspectiveness, which is also latent in the infinite state. And this manifestation, of perspectiveness, bestows upon the most original beyond state of God the prospect of an infinite aspect different from that of the most original and eternal state. The second state of God accordingly comes into being only as another infinite aspect of the most original first state. This second state of the 10 principal states of God is called the original beyond state of God. It is to be heeded well that this original second state of God, denoted in the chart as 2 and termed God in beyond state, is in no way to be taken as a state of God altogether other than the most original first state of God, denoted in the chart as I, Roman numeral I, or Roman numeral 1, and termed God in beyond state. Read that again. It is to be heeded well that this original second state of God, denoted in the chart as 2 and termed God in beyond state, is in no way to be taken as a state of God altogether other than the most original first state of God, denoted in the chart as 1 and termed God in beyond state. The only difference between state 1 and state 2 of God is that state 1 is of unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, where even the remotest prospect of the insurge of the infinite whim is inconceivable. Therefore, only at the instant when the original infinite whim insurges in the infinitude of the God is state could infinite God conceive the infinite original urge to know as, quote, who am I? That is, only when the aspectless state 1 of God in beyond gets the aspect of state 2 of God in beyond. Parat Par Brahma thus gets the infinite aspect of Paramatma. It is also to be noted very carefully that the beyond state marked in the chart as 2 is fundamentally the same as the beyond state of God marked in the chart as 1. But in the chart, these two states, state 1 and state 2, are depicted separately, because even though state 2 of God in beyond state is the same original state of God, yet it is not the most original state of God, which is the beyond state. This necessarily follows because God could conceive the infinite insurge of the infinite original whim and could get the infinite original impulse of the infinite original urge to know as, quote, who am I, only in state 2. When God eternally in state 1 assumes the infinite original aspect of state 2 within his own eternal state 1, which is the most original beyond state. Read that sentence again. This necessarily follows because God could conceive the infinite insurge of the infinite original whim and could get the infinite original impulse of the infinite original urge to know as, quote, who am I, only in state 2. When God eternally in state 1 assumes the infinite original aspect of state 2 within his own eternal state 1, which is the most original beyond state. To be more explicit, in both these states of God, states 1 and 2, except for the eternally manifest infinity of the eternal infinitude of God, parentheses, as the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, all attributes, all aspects, all states, infinite and most finite consciousness and unconsciousness of God, including God's own infinite trio nature of power, knowledge, and bliss, and all other things, are all latent in the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum. All this that is latent in the infinitude could only have the scope of manifestation in state 2 of God, which may be said to differ from state 1 only in this respect, of having this infinite scope of manifestation of all that is infinitely and most finitely latent as the nothing in the infinitude of God as the everything. Consequently, the infinite original whim of God, when it once surged, had the feasibility of surging only in state 2 of God, and when it surged, it did so uniformly in the infinitude of God. But when the whim surged, the insurge of this whim could never be experienced by God in his infinitely most independent beyond state 1. It was experienced by God eternally in the most original beyond state, only through the infinite aspect of his state 2 as God in the beyond state. Hence, the infinite insurge of the infinite original whim and its consequent infinite repercussions are in reality affected in the state 2 of God in the beyond state. At the instant when the infinite original whim surged and God had the infinite original urge to know as, quote, who am I, the infinite uniformity of the infinite insurge of the whim spontaneously made manifest both the latent infinite consciousness and the latent infinite unconsciousness of God, simultaneously in the original beyond state of God, who is, nevertheless, eternally in the most original beyond state. This spontaneous manifestation of the latent infinite consciousness and infinite unconsciousness simultaneously is beyond the grasp of human intellect to understand and digest. It is indeed a paradox of the realm of reality, and it defeats all human understanding. How could God gain spontaneously his own infinite consciousness and his infinite unconsciousness simultaneously? Meher Baba, while explaining this, declared that this is a fact, and it is of the realm of reality, but it can never be understood or grasped by the mind. It is only to be realized on realizing the reality. At the same time, in order that we may get at least some concept of this fact effected in reality, and that we may not take it as a mere paradoxical mystery, Meher Baba made us understand this apparent paradox through the example of a child in a mother's womb. When the mother conceives, the child is under development in the mother's womb, and as soon as the development reaches a stage when, along with other developments, the eyes of the child are fully molded, the child gains the faculties of seeing and not seeing simultaneously. Irrespective of whether the child after birth sees or does not see, the very fact that the eyes have been molded in the womb of his mother gives to the child the dual aspect of his own eyes. In the eyes, as soon as they are developed, the faculties of seeing and not seeing are simultaneously contained. When the child opens his eyes, he will see, and when he closes his eyes, he will not see. But the fact still holds good that no sooner were the eyes developed than there was contained in them the dual faculty of seeing and not seeing simultaneously. Similarly, when the insurge of the original infinite whim in God, both the infinite consciousness and unconsciousness latent in God were manifested simultaneously, which to the limited mind appears paradoxical. Thus God in his most original state, one of the beyond, gained spontaneously, through his original state, two of the beyond, his own infinitely unconscious state and his own infinitely conscious state simultaneously, depicted in the chart as states A and B respectively. Consequently, on the one hand, with the spontaneous manifestation of infinite unconsciousness, God in his infinite unconscious beyond state, shown as A in the chart, eternally remains not only infinitely unconscious of his own eternal infinite existence, as in the most original beyond state of infinitude absolute, but he also eternally remains infinitely unconscious of his own begotten infinite original beyond state, shown in the chart as 2. On the other hand, simultaneously with the spontaneous manifestation of infinite consciousness, God in his infinite conscious beyond state, marked in the chart as B, eternally becomes not only infinitely conscious of his own eternal infinite existence, as in the most original beyond state of infinitude absolute, but he also becomes, most obviously, infinitely conscious of his own begotten infinite original beyond state, shown in the chart as 2. In other words, only in the beyond state of God, marked in the chart as state 2, God spontaneously, with the insurge of the infinite original whim, simultaneously begets his eternal infinite unconscious state, marked as substate A, and his eternal infinite conscious state, marked as substate B. Substate A is of God in beyond state, marked as state 2. This substate A is of divine infinite unconsciousness of God's own infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. God in this substate A neither consciously experiences his own trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, nor uses them. Substate B is also of God in beyond state, marked as state 2. This substate B is attributeless and formless, but it is of highest divine consciousness of God's own infinite trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. God in this substate B consciously experiences his own infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. but he does not use them. He is conscious of his reality, but unconscious of illusion. In Vedantic terminology, it is thus that the state 1 of Parabrahma begets the state 2 of Paramatma. And in this state 2, God as Paramatma is eternally unconscious and simultaneously eternally conscious of his own most original state of Parabrahma. This infinite dual aspect of the Paramatma state is pointed out in the chart as state A and state B respectively. It naturally follows, therefore, that the eternal unconscious state of Paramatma, marked A, in the eternal original beyond state, marked 2, eternally aspires to attain the eternal conscious state of Paramatma, marked B, which is the second of the dual infinite aspects of the original beyond state, God state, Paramatma, marked 2. Consequently, the divine goal is that the unconscious state of God in A should attain the conscious reality of the conscious state of God in B. In short, when state A consciously realizes state B, the divine goal is attained. For state A to realize consciously state B, there is no other alternative but that state A must gradually experience transmutation into state B and eventually become state B in all respects consciously. This gradual transmutation of the unconscious infinite state of God into the conscious infinite state is depicted through states 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, those are Roman numerals, as different states of God in the chart of the 10 states of God. In state 8, state A of God becomes fully conscious of state B. In this state 8, the unconscious infinite state A of God not only gains the highest divine consciousness of state B, but God becomes divinely absorbed in the reality of his own infinite conscious state, and so realizes his eternal identity with the infinite conscious state B of God. If God, divinely absorbed, as in state 8, recovers and maintains normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross spheres through his mental, subtle, and gross aspects as an embodiment of a perfect human being, then state 9, at the divine junction between states 8 and 10, is attained. After this 9th state, the 10th state of God is depicted in the chart and connected with the God state C. This 10th state of God is the state of God qualitied and manifest in the human form of a perfect master. In state 10, God consciously experiences his own trio nature of infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, and also uses them through the divine office of God, state 10, marked in the chart as C. It is also to be well noted that God in the infinite unconscious state A is neither nirguna, parentheses, attributeless, nirakar, parentheses, formless, nor saguna, parentheses, with attributes, sakar, parentheses, with form. But state B is of nirguna nirakar, parentheses, attributeless and formless, and state C, which is also of the original beyond God state, is of Saguna Sakar, parentheses, with attributes and form. It is that highest state of man-God where God is infinitely conscious of both reality and illusion. State 3. God as emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. In this state, God brings into play his three principal attributes, sifat, parentheses, sifat, of emanating, sustaining, and dissolving. This three-in-one state corresponds to the trinity of Vedanta: Brahma, parentheses, creator, Vishnu, parentheses, preserver, and Mahesh, parentheses, destroyer. The Sufi synonyms of which are the terms Afridgar, Parvardagar, and Fanakar. The three attributes of God are expressed through the three archangels: Israfil, the angel who creates life; Mikael, the angel who sustains life; and Israel, the angel who destroys life. The triple attributes of state 3 of God were latent in the most original state 1 of God. These simultaneously unfolded themselves spontaneously at that instant when the original infinite whim surged in God, and when he conceived in his state 2 the infinite urge to know himself as, quote, who am I? At that instant of the insurge of the infinite whim, God in his state 2 gained simultaneously the infinite dual aspects of being infinitely unconscious, as in his state A, and at the same time of being infinitely conscious, as in his state B. Nevertheless, the infinite original urge to know himself obviously persists still in God's state A, which is yet infinitely unconscious of himself. The infinite urge to know himself persisting in this infinitely unconscious state A of God made possible the manifestations of all the qualities and aspects of God latent as the nothing in the infinitude of the most original state 1 of God as the everything. But all that is latent as the nothing in the everything could be possibly conceived as latent in the beyond state 2 of God only. Wherefore, all that is latent in the beyond state of God is gradually unfolded, propelled by the infinite urge, and is spontaneously made to manifest as all that is of the nothing. Hence, the nothingness of the nothing that is manifested is the creation, and this creation springs forth out of the infinite urge to know in the infinite unconscious state A of God. Consequently, it is only natural that the infinite unconscious state A of God gains the first attribute as emanator of the three infinite attributes: God the Creator, God the Preserver, and God the Dissolver or Destroyer. For God to have gained the attribute of emanator, he obviously becomes the creator of creation, as in his state 3. It then follows most naturally that when God creates, he must spontaneously also sustain what he creates. He then obviously becomes also the preserver of creation, as in his state Roman numeral 3. And in the very act of preserving what is created, God also simultaneously establishes the inevitable dissolution or destruction of creation. Preservation would be meaningless if dissolution or destruction were not anticipated. Accordingly, God obviously becomes also the dissolver or destroyer of creation, as in his state 3. State 3 of God is that state in which God becomes the creator and simultaneously remains the sustainer or preserver and dissolver or destroyer of his own creation. At one and the same time, God thus becomes the creator, preserver, and destroyer in state 3. The infinite original whim that surged in God and the consequent infinite urge to know himself made manifest in God the infinite triple attributes of creator, preserver, and dissolver, with all the paraphernalia of the nothingness of the latent nothing. This nothingness literally is nothing, although it appears to exist through illusion, sometimes called Maya as the creation. And here we have note 35 of the supplement. Titled Maya, with an asterisk. Meher Baba, Maya as quoted in The Quest of Truth, Irene Conybeare. The force that keeps a man spiritually blind, deaf, etc., is his own ignorance, which is governed by the principle of cosmic ignorance, generally known as Maya. Asterisk, see also Meher Baba, Maya, Discourses, pages 370, 387. To understand Maya is to understand the universe. All false values and false beliefs are due to the grip of Maya. Intellect in particular plays into the hands of Maya, for intellect is not capable of that consciousness which realizes that God is truth. Truth can only be known after one transcends the cosmic illusion, which appears as real owing to Maya. Maya, the principle of ignorance, can only be transcended when the spiritual aspirant is able to realize that Maya is God's shadow and as such is nothing. The enigma of Maya solves itself only after self-realization. Go back to page 169. Meher Baba has told us that there is no creation in the literal sense of the word. What we call creation is a manifestation of countless forms of the nothing. This nothing is really no thing, but it exists in its own field of illusion. It cannot be denied, but it is not beyond the everything that is God. Although the everything includes this nothing, the nothing never does and never can include or mean the everything. The Almighty alone is the everything, including the nothing, and before creation manifested itself, there was literally and absolutely no thing but the Almighty as the everything. Zat the Allah ki ar jalvek sabruposh the iksaut I sermadi za nagme sab kamosh the tha fakat maikana saki the navan mainosh the kayinate dahard kya rul ul amin bihosh the zindagi jab muskarai hai kaza kasamne. It's a quote of Munsif Asghar. The translation is, the existence of Allah alone was, and all manifestations were latent therein. One eternal sound prevailed, and all musical notes were dormant therein. Only the tavern was there, no cupbearers and wine drinkers. The gross universe was out of the question. Even the angelic world was not in existence. When with the divine command, be, life smilingly sprang up. The Almighty alone existed, but he was only latently conscious, and hence he did not know himself. And in the same way that consciousness was latent in him, so also creation was latent in him. The difference between the latent and the manifest creation may be compared to that between a seed and a tree. But whether seed or tree, latent or manifest, creation is always no thing, because it is the latent nothing that is manifested as the nothingness. All that is latent as the nothing in the beyond state, too, of the infinitude of God as the everything, is expressed and manifested through a most finite point in the infinitude of God. This point is called the creation point or the Om point. Asterisk. See also Francis Brabazon's Stay with God, pages 65 to 66. Through this point, creation has been precipitated. This creation point was also latent in the most original state one of God in the beyond state. The process of emanating, sustaining, and dissolving, which is constantly and uniformly going on, may be illustrated by an analogy. Let us imagine that a human body is God. The human body, sleeping with eyes shut, may be compared to the beyond state of God as state 2a. The very first moment of opening the eyes may be compared to the state of God as creator. The subsequent condition of remaining awake may be compared to the state of God as sustainer, and going back to sleep again with eyes shut may be compared to the state of God as dissolver. Thus God is the creator, sustainer, and dissolver, all three in one, at one and the same time. State 4. God as embodied soul. Didapnitius kvahish apkohar tara bana deka. Quote by Niaz. He desired to see himself. Hence he assumed to himself varied aspects involving names and forms. In order to understand how the infinitely unconscious state A of God becomes gradually transmuted into the infinitely conscious state B of God and attains full and infinite consciousness, Mir Baba gave the following analogy. Imagine the infinitely unconscious God state A before the creation came into being as motionless infinite ocean. A puff of wind then stirred the tranquil uniformity of this ocean, and immense waves, countless drops of water, and innumerable bubbles appeared from out of the uniformity of the limitless infinite ocean. The puff of wind that set the ocean into commotion may be compared to the impulse of the infinite original urge to know, originating with the infinite original whim of God, surging in God to know himself through his infinite God state too. The stir on the surface of the ocean caused by the infinite urge surcharged every drop of that infinite ocean with the infinite original urge to know itself. Thus, Paramatma, in his infinitely unconscious state A, being urged to know himself, simultaneously bestirs the tranquil poise of every Atma in Paramatma with an urge to know itself. This could only be understood when Paramatma is compared to an infinite ocean, and the Atmas to the drops of that infinite ocean. But it also must be well noted that every drop of the ocean, when in the ocean, is ocean itself, until the drops inherit individuality through bubble formations over the surface of the ocean. Every bubble thus formed would then bestow a separate and a particular individuality upon every drop. And this created separateness would exist within the uniform indivisibility of the drops of that infinite ocean, as long as these bubbles creating separateness exist. As soon as the bubbles burst, the drops which are and were already in the ocean itself come to realize that they are and were one with the infinite ocean, and they gain this consciousness of their eternal infinity in the infinite ocean only after they first experience separateness, and then dispel the bubbles of ignorance that were instrumental in bestowing upon them the experience of their apparent separateness from their inherent indivisibility. As long as the infinitely innumerable drops of the ocean do not experience apparent separateness, they fail to realize their own homogeneous and indivisible eternal infinite existence as ocean itself. It is only through the experience of apparent separateness that Atmas can consciously realize their indivisible oneness as Paramatma. In order to describe the God state, Roman numeral 4, of God, quote, God as embodied soul, quote, let us think of one infinitely unconscious soul, Atma, of Paramatma in state A. In the beginning, in state A, the soul, Atma, has no consciousness and has no impressions, sanskaras. Therefore, at that stage and in that state, the soul, Atma, has no gross form, gross body, subtle body, nor mental body, because the existence of gross, subtle, and mental impressions, sanskaras, only can give existence to gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and only the existence of these bodies can make possible the existence of gross, subtle, and mental worlds. Hence, in the beginning, the soul in God state A, being infinitely unconscious and being impressionless, had no consciousness of gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and was also unconscious of its infinite self. The soul naturally then had no experience of the gross, subtle, and mental worlds, and also had no experience of the Oversoul, Paramatma. Now this infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with the first impulse, which we called the first urge, parentheses, the first urge to know itself. Simultaneously with reverberations of the first urge to know itself, a most gross first impression emerged, objectifying the soul as the absolutely opposite and most finite counterpart of the absolutely infinite Oversoul. The soul, being eternally in the Oversoul and one with the Oversoul, has also the infinite potentialities of the Oversoul, though latent in its unconscious state. Thus the soul is also the possessor of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. Therefore, when the impressionless infinite soul receives the very first impression, this impression could be nothing other than the most gross impression, because the soul itself, which is the possessor of infinite knowledge, tries to gain knowledge of its own self. This very conception on the part of the possessor of infinite knowledge is infinitely crude or gross, and this infinitely crude or gross conception of the infinite soul imparted to the impressionless soul the most gross first impression. Simultaneously with the most gross first impression, the infinitely unconscious soul also gained the most finite first consciousness. With the increasing gross impressions, the consciousness evolved, and the evolution of gross forms gained momentum. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of gross forms, and the evolution of the experiences of the gross world were all affected as the result of the first urge of God to know himself. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite unconscious soul gained the aspects of experience for the first time. This first experience of the infinite soul was that it, soul, Atma, experienced a contrariety, absolutely opposite by nature, in its identity with the infinite, impressionless, unconscious state A of Paramatma. Read that again. This first experience of the infinite soul was that it, soul, Atma, experienced a contrariety, absolutely opposite by nature, in its identity with the infinite, impressionless, unconscious state A of Paramatma. This experience of contrariety effected changeableness in the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul, and spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise and unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul, with a recoil or tremendous shock which impregnated the infinite unconsciousness of the infinitely unconscious soul, Atma, with first consciousness of its apparent separateness from the indivisible state of Paramatma. But the soul being infinite, the first consciousness that it derived from the recoil or shock of the absolutely opposite and most gross first impression of its separateness was naturally and necessarily most finite first consciousness. The first consciousness gained by the soul was obviously most finite in proportion to the experience of absolute opposites of its own original infinite state, as in A. Consequently, it then means that in the beginning, when the impressionless infinite soul was first impressioned, such first impression was an absolutely absolutely most finite gross impression. The first consciousness it, the soul or Atma, derived was most finite. Naturally, at that instant, the unconsciousness of the infinite soul actually experienced a most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression. Now, if the soul is conscious of impressions, sanskaras, then the soul must necessarily experience these impressions. And in order to experience the impressions, the consciousness of the soul must experience them through proper and suitable media. As the impressions are, so are the experiences of the impressions, and likewise so are the proper media to experience the impressions. That is to say, the impressions give rise to experiences, and to experience the impressions, the use of appropriate media is essential. Therefore, as the infinite, eternal, and formless soul has now gotten the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression, most obviously and necessarily, this first consciousness of the soul must utilize the most finite and the most gross first medium to experience the most gross first impression. This first medium adopted by God in his state 4, Roman numeral 4, parentheses, God as embodied soul, is a first form which, although it is gross, yet it is so inconceivably, infinitely finite that it cannot even be considered as gross. It is so very infinitely shapeless and substanceless, matterless and formless, that it cannot lead one even to imagine that it is gross. Yet this form is the very first gross form that emerges, simultaneously, as if in three prongs, as the first three of the foremost 7 gas-like forms. If a description of these first 3 gas-like forms could ever be attempted, they could only be described from the standpoint of density. The first having infinitely negligible density, then in the next stage, negligible density, and in the third stage, as having the first traces of density. These first 3 forms have no evolution. The next 3 forms may come within the scope of our imagination and may be described as semi-gaseous and semi-material forms. Evolution begins with the 4th gas-like form, and finally there is the 7th gas-like form of the series of 7 foremost gas-like forms, which is hydrogen, and which may be said to include the electron. It should be noted well that the first 6 gas-like gross forms bear no resemblance to the various gases such as hydrogen, nitrogen, and so forth. They are much, much finer, parentheses, not subtler, asterisk. This is in no way to be connected with any form or object of the subtle world, because these forms are solely of the gross world. So they are much, much finer, parentheses, not subtler, than those with which the scientists of the age are well conversant. State 5. God as soul in the state of evolution. God as embodied soul now begins to become conscious and begins to know the creation, the nothingness, although his knowing of the creation at this stage is infinitely negligible. Even this most finite consciousness and this minutest knowing, however, creates more impressions, sanskaras, that cause the drops, soul, atma, self, to leave or dissociate from the original first bubble form. Leaving the bubble is equivalent to a dropping off of or dissociating from the first form. Even after the form is dropped, the impressions gathered by the evolving consciousness of the soul do not vanish. These impressions remain associated with the evolved consciousness and cause the evolving consciousness of the soul to associate with another appropriate and superior bubble, parentheses, form. The soul is thus able to know or experience more of the creation through the second form. The angle of vision widens and the consciousness of knowing increases in proportion to the simultaneous evolution of form. With the evolution or growth in gross consciousness, the impressions, sanskaras, also increase and cause the soul to assume or associate with a still more complex gross form, in accordance with the impressions retained by the consciousness when the second gross form is abandoned. In this way, the evolution of consciousness progresses for ages, concurrently with the evolution of forms, which help to experience and concurrently exhaust the impressions gathered, until after countless changes of forms through more concrete and successive stages of stones, metals, plants, worms, fishes, birds, and animals, the soul takes on the human form. In other words, the cycle of evolution of consciousness of soul continues evolving further and greater consciousness with the evolution of forms of higher and higher types, while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the next lower type. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness of souls apparently tends the souls to identify themselves with and gather varied, innumerable impressions of higher and higher gross species of forms, unlimited in number in the gross world. The clean-cut major forms with which the souls associate with every leap of greater and greater consciousness are in accordance with the leaps from stone to metal, from metal to plant, from plant to worm, from worm to fish, from fish to bird, from bird to animal, and ultimately the last and seventh leap is from animal to human form. It is very important to understand that the process of evolution of consciousness concerns the evolution of bubbles or forms only, and not the drops or the souls. The souls remain as indivisible and infinite as the unlimited ocean, Paramatma. From the beginning until the end of evolution of consciousness, which terminates with the completion of evolution of form. Only through this evolution of form does the consciousness of ignorance, or the knowing of creation, increase step by step due to varied experiences, and only in the human form can the individualized soul, Atma, eventually realize the Oversoul or Paramatma. As the soul is infinite, the consciousness of the soul must also become infinite. And because consciousness can become infinite only in human form, the human form is therefore the final stage of evolution of form. The soul has to pass through 8,400,000 (84 lakhs) of human forms after it has once commenced to reincarnate in the human form until it has attained God realization. The pre-human forms through which it has to pass before it can incarnate in the human form are innumerable. We'll read that paragraph again. The soul has to pass through 8,400,000 (84 lakhs) human forms after it has once commenced to reincarnate in the human form until it has attained God realization. The pre-human forms through which it has to pass before it can incarnate in the human form are innumerable. Strictly speaking, there is only one form, the human form, which is latent in all of the previous forms. The mineral, the plant, and the animal forms actually contain the human form in its latent state, and this is gradually and increasingly manifested until it is at last completely expressed as a human being in a human body. Before the human form becomes completely manifested in a human body, such as a man or a woman, the latent human form makes a series of partial turns. In the crystalline rock state, such as granite, the latent human form is completely upside down, and is almost so in the plant state as well. As the forms progress or evolve, the axis of the body rotates slowly so that it becomes more and more horizontal. And when we reach the higher vertebrates, we find the head rising up more and more as the axis of the body approaches the vertical. In men and women, we find the human form completely expressed and completely vertical. The details of this evolution of form are extremely complex. There are, for example, certain species of stone, metal, plant, and animal that have what Meher Baba described as a special seat in evolution. These key species of forms are mostly those that are milestones on the evolutionary road, and they mark the first and the last of a certain general class of species of forms. For example, the first species of bird form to follow the last species of fish form, and the first species of the animal form to follow the last species of the bird form, have a special, quote, seat, significance in evolution. Meher Baba tells us that this whole theme has been explained down to the last detail in his own book. Asterisk. The book referred to should not be confused with this publication. Meher Baba has authored an additional work which might be published later. That's editor's note. So Meher Baba tells us that this whole theme has been explained down to the last detail in his own book that is still to be handed over to the world. Just as there is evolution of consciousness and evolution of forms, so also there is evolution of the worlds. The evolved consciousness of the soul, identifying the soul with evolved forms, gets more and more impressioned, and in order to exhaust these impressions, it consistently finds its field of expression, and it experiences these impressions on the earth, which is also evolving concurrently with other worlds in accordance with the progressive evolution of the entire cosmic creation. During the course of evolution of consciousness of the soul, while consciously identifying itself with varied, finite, gross forms, was also simultaneously, though unconsciously, identifying itself with its finite subtle form and its finite mental form, which associated with the soul, Atma, in compact, homogeneous, unconscious association throughout the course of evolution of consciousness, right from the first urge. During the whole course of the evolution of consciousness, while the soul frequently and consciously dissociates itself from the finite gross forms, which act as media to experience and exhaust the impressions while evolving greater and greater consciousness, the soul never dissociates itself consciously or unconsciously from its finite subtle form and its finite mental form. On the contrary, when the soul dissociates its identification with any one medium of finite gross form, it is the unconscious association of the soul with its subtle form that fortifies the soul. Then, without any gross medium, with finite energy, the driving force, to tend the consciousness of the soul towards identifying itself with yet another form, i.e., the next medium of the next finite gross form, to experience the impressions of the last dissociated finite gross form, retained and reflected by the finite mental form of the soul, which is also in unconscious association with the soul. It is only natural that, together with the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul, the evolution of the finite subtle form of the soul also takes place to fortify the soul with greater finite energy, to tend the consciousness of the more and more gross conscious soul, to identify itself with higher and higher types of finite gross forms, evolved by the impressions of the last lower and finite gross form. Similarly, the evolution of the finite mental form of the soul also takes place simultaneously to accommodate, retain, and reflect the increasingly innumerable, varied impressions gained and gathered by the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul. Thus it is that only in a human form are the subtle body and the mental body fully developed. Hence, the soul, associating itself consciously with human form, is, so to speak, fully equipped with gross body, subtle body, and mental body in human form, together with the full consciousness of the gross gained in the human form. Nevertheless, although the soul has gained full consciousness in human form and so experiences the gross world, yet the gross conscious human soul is unconscious of the subtle body and therefore cannot experience the subtle world. The gross conscious human soul is also unconscious of the mental body and therefore cannot experience the mental world.